I think something that's coming up again is the concept that China is a neocolonial power in Africa. There's a lot of talk about that. And to me, it speaks to how in the West we completely underestimate the intentional underdevelopment of Africa under Western colonialism and imperialism. I think you pointed out something really important about Ibrahim Traore. Deng Xiaoping also said development is the hard truth. And I think this is like the proof is in the pudding. Development is a thing, not the propaganda, not what you're saying, but development is the thing that will sustain a country's sovereignty and their socialist revolution. Now we know that 52 African countries are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you sort of unpack the realities of this? Because, like you were saying before, there's 100 and I think 40 or more countries in the Belt and Road Initiative. Sovereignty is key for how a country develops. You have to have the political will in the country to develop. But definitely the Belt and Road Initiative, because it is a development model that is without strings, makes a huge difference within that paradigm. But can you help unpack that more? Because again, that's one of the key propaganda points that the West is using.
What I try to explain to people is you have to understand, once you understand the interest of a country, you can understand what type of relationship you will have with said country. So, my understanding of China's interest in Africa is China wants to see people's spending power increase so they can buy Chinese goods. They have a vested interest in seeing Africa develop so they can buy things from China. That's one of the things. The West doesn't have a vested interest in, has the vested interest in the opposite. The reason why I grew up in Birmingham in the UK, the reason why Cadbury makes chocolate in Birmingham, but the cocoa comes from Ghana, is because cocoa farmers in Ghana are poor, and the country of Ghana is incentivized to make sure that things are not sold as chocolate in Ghana, they're sold as cocoa. So we're always selling the raw product, not the finished product. So yeah, the West has a vested interest in making sure that Africa remains poor because a report came out that British companies control around $1 trillion worth of African mines. How can that happen if Africa is wealthy, if it's developed, if people are not paid? I just went to Mombasa to show solidarity with the dock workers on strike and the factory workers there. They're paid 200 Kenyan shillings a day. 200 Kenyan shillings a day is about $1.50. How can they make the extortionate amounts of profit if people are paid, what they're paid in the UK? Arguments say, what's the minimum wage at the moment? £8.20 per hour. Yeah, what would that do to their profits? So there's vested interest in keeping from one side and keeping us where we are, and on the other side in seeing us develop. And so that is why it's not, when we shouldn't enter these things blindly and just hope people's intentions are good. It's all about interest. And right now, in this particular time, and since the Chinese Revolution, our interest and China's interest align. And while they continue to align, then we have to continue the partnership and development. Something I found interesting, I didn't know this. I didn't realize that China wasn't, quote unquote, invited into the UN until I believe the 70s. And when they were invited into the UN, it was the inclusion of the newly independent African states at the UN General Assembly that helped that process. And actually, the speeches at the time from the Chinese official was, this is by and part in thanks to our African brothers. So we have a shared history against colonialism, against imperialism. Only once China became so big to ignore that it actually got accepted into the fold. And that's what we need to do. We need to get to a point where we're too big to ignore, that they can't isolate us, that they can't refuse us access on the UN Security Council, that they can't remove us from the decision-making process in our continent. President Museveni of Uganda said that in the lead up of the NATO bombardment of Libya in 2011, him and I think three other presidents were desperately trying to get to Libya to negotiate something with Gaddafi to stop, the NATO bombardment. NATO said to them, if you go there, we can't guarantee your safety, which is basically a thinly veiled threat. Yeah. So we're not even allowed to be involved in the decision-making process in our own continent, let alone, on the global stage, which I think is where our future should be and God willing will be.